everyone. We are Khushi and Deepraj. We have decided to structure this presentation more like a podcast where we'll be discussing the larger tenets of privacy and security, following which we will continue with our opinions on how a balance between the two could be achieved. And true to its form, this is structured as more of a conversation where we also invite you to follow along the discussion through comments on Flipgrid. The final version will include some audiovisual cues to aid our points.
A beautiful sight, we're happy tonight, walking in a winter wonderland.
So, privacy. In the simplest of terms, this is the idea that we as individuals or entities, because it addresses corporations as well, have complete control over how our data is collected, shared, and used. It stems from the fundamental idea that we own our data, and that inherently ties to our liberty protections as individuals. That is the protection of personal space from state control. Now, security, on the other hand, is this overarching idea of protection that we get as members of society from the governments that we have elected, hopefully. The general understanding of security, however, is especially when we are discussing in context of privacy, is the protection of data itself. But in our discussion today, we'll work with the broader definition of security of the citizens of a country. And to allow your government to extend some type of protection to its citizens, like we discussed, a certain level of compromise in privacy is expected. This compromise comes in the form of surveillance. Now, for a long time, these two ideas have, in a way, been locking horns with each other. And before we dive deeper into surveillance, Khushi, do you want to tell us a little bit more about these debates?
Right. So now coming to the long-standing debate of privacy versus security, here's what the professor of information ethics at the University of Washington, Adam Moore, has to say in his 2011 paper. In times of national crisis, citizens are often asked to trade liberty and privacy for security. And why not, it is argued, if we can obtain a fair amount of security for just a little privacy. However, the issue here is not just a little privacy. It's a lot. Now, when we talk about personal privacy in the context of our phone records or genetic data or encrypted messaging, we are not talking about anything even remotely like an instinctive human understanding of privacy. Instead, we're talking about the collection and use of personal data at scale. Governments and corporations accumulating massive amounts of highly personal information from billions of people and hence using that for surveillance.
Yeah, everything changes when we talk of things on scale. Now, there are two types of surveillance that we know of. First is targeted surveillance. This is when we know who a perpetrator is, and we're trying to acquire more information about this particular individual. Now, our clean listeners, like we would want to call them, address them as, would have already noticed the problems with this definition. Because who a perpetrator is defined by the government in the first place. Someone who is a perpetrator in one country, say a political activist, would not be a perpetrator in a different country. We will discuss these issues in a while, but for the sake of our definition, let's stick to the easier, for the lack of a better word, understanding of perpetrator. So someone who did something really terrible that we all agree with. Now, this is the kind of surveillance most of us would be okay with, provided we have ensured universal protection of human rights. If one commits a crime that all of us agree with, which is where law comes from, they lose their right to civil liberties, which is the idea behind our prison systems. And by extension, the punishment would also remove their privacy. So they've lost their rights there as well. Targeted surveillance then for these people feels like an okay breach that we can allow. However, it is the second type of surveillance that is of a greater concern. That is mass surveillance. This is when countries deploy large-scale data collection programs to spy on their own citizens, and obviously often people beyond their borders as well. They do this to have instantaneous access to them whenever they want for reasons of national security. We'll also go into this in a while. We'll also go deeper into mass surveillance, but even before that, a different problem comes up. Depending on the type of targeted surveillance you want to do, you will need to have systems of mass surveillance. Now, this creates a dangerous dependency cycle where we can't have one thing without the other. And you can start to notice how difficult these conversations are.
Exactly. So the rise of mass surveillance is actually a recent phenomenon, especially after the rise of public displays of terrorism, such as the 9/11 attack. Governments chipped away at our civil liberties under the veil of increased security. Now, we have discussed the origins of today's biggest threats of terrorism, as well as the efficacy of these mass surveillance measures in curbing threats at length in class. A quick recap, they are done. Often, governments use the phrase, if you haven't done anything wrong, you have nothing to hide, to back up their ever-expanding power of surveillance. Now, upon first thought, this argument seems to hold as most people are law-abiding and will never be targeted under these technologies. However, the very existence of an invasive mass surveillance mechanism is prone to abuse. The government already has access to their own technology that can easily track an individual to a certain degree of correctness, and at the same time, they have easy access to an individual's purchase history, phone records, email contents, private messages, and even their commute patterns. Constant collection and archiving of this data creates a huge risk of personal abuse by the law enforcement officers with access. Now, one such instance is when Benjamin Robinson, a special agent for the US Department of Commerce, was caught in September 2007 for using a government database called the Treasury Enforcement Communication System, TECS, for tracking the travel patterns of his ex-girlfriend and her family. Records show that he used the system illegally at least 163 times before he got caught. Now, this is just one such incident among the millions that we know of. Think about all such instances that we may not even be aware of. This just goes on to show just how dangerous these gross breaches of privacy could look like if the amount of personal data collected by the watchful eyes of a government is left unchecked.
Yeah, and that's super scary. Like, imagine someone just having access to all of your movement patterns, among other things, and especially if that's an ex of yours. Anyway, and governments will usually attribute these specific violations to rogue agents, like in Benjamin's case, and take actions, but they usually come more of a more like a reaction after they have found that this has happened. But it's the same thing. It's too little, too late, and by then the damage has already been done, be it psychological or physical. There is an even more sinister issue at play here. In software development, there is a very well-known concept of feature creep. It's also called scope creep. This means that after developing a software and releasing it to the public, or even like if it's an internal software, it works there as well. Over time, we as the initial developers end up introducing a lot of features to the product. Now that can be either by user demand or to keep up with the growth that we saw in initial stages, and even like keeping up with our competition. Now, this feature addition usually happens often to the point that the original intent of the software is lost. And the software ends up being very hard to work with for your users, because the more things you add, the design gets more complicated. Now, Peter Hustings, former European data protection supervisor, they had this post back in 2009, long before that, but this person was in this post in 2009. He introduced a similar idea called function creep. That was in context of large-scale databases of personal information, which is often a byproduct of master surveillance, if you think about it. He said that even if current legislation limits the use of a particular large-scale database with private data of a lot of people, say your biometric data that countries sometimes do on a large scale, like you would have seen when Aadhaar was first introduced, biometric data was included along with iris scan with your Aadhaar card. There is no guarantee that like the limits that we have on that data with current legislation will stay in the future. There is no guarantee of that. There could be function creep, where the same database whose limitations have well been followed for a long time, in conjunction with an entirely different set of data, ends up revealing patterns a lot more pervasive than what was originally intended of this database.
Now, privacy is supposed to be the right of an individual to be free from uninvited surveillance. To safely exist in one's space and freely express one's opinions behind closed doors is critical to living in a democratic society. However, despite being citizens of a society that promises us liberty rights, as Deepraj explained earlier, we are far from being free from mass surveillance. But we also can't live in a world where every criminal has complete privacy, yet we can't give away all of our personal data in the name of patriotism. So, how exactly do we strike the right balance? Now, as is the case with any discussion about our lived reality, the answer is nuanced. We are going to take our liberty and imagine this debate as a literal balance. Hence, we obviously cannot have the scale tipped to either of the extremes.
But I wonder, and I'm sure others listening to this will do too, how did we arrive at this place where pervasive measures are commonplace? The answer lies in an unrelated area, Moore's law. Gordon Moore, the co-founder and chairman emeritus of Intel, has a famous quote attributed to him that essentially says, computing chips will shrink by half in size and cost every 18 to 24 months. Now, how is a law about computer CPUs related to lost liberty rights in the world today? It has more to do with the idea behind this law, which is exponential growth. Obviously, the exponential growth in computing has resulted in technological development at breakneck speeds. This has left regulations playing catch up with the rest of the world as we move on from technology to technology and company to company. It is this lack of regulation that has allowed for things to get out of control in the first place. And it is in both of our opinions that improved regulations will help in keeping that balance between privacy and security. However, a legal framework tasked with something as essential should, again, in our opinion, focus on certain basic tenets. First, systemic access framework. This has to be a law which will create a systemic access framework for the government to acquire data from private data controllers. Because as it stands, most of our user data is with private companies, mostly tech companies. By the way, I should preface all of our discussion, like rest of our discussion with this. A framework like what we are discussing now will work best if the rest of the tenets, this is the first tenet, if the rest of the tenets we will talk about later are also followed, because a framework without them is just a system in itself and the government can do whatever they want with it. This framework will allow us to maintain a record of all the access requests made by the government. It should also present reasonable limitations on both the number of accesses made by the government as well as the volume of data requested over, it could be an agreed time frame, like a year. Now, why would we want to limit number as well as volume in a system like this? The importance will be clear through some examples. In Germany, for instance, police departments have the ability to request cell phone metadata from telecom service providers. Reports show that the Berlin Police Department requested metadata under this provision to help them with their investigations, a total of 410 times between 2008 and 2012. Now, that number looks quite low given the time frame of 4 years. It's just 410. But these same requests resulted in the disclosure of 4.2 million cell phone records of German citizens. Similarly, the US government agencies made over 1.3 million such demands in 2011 alone. The study that reported this number also had the following to say. The figure of 1.3 million is still understated since one major carrier did not disclose the number of requests it had received. That sometimes happens because the US government requests certain private data and it's done through national security letters, NSLs, and it will usually come with a gag order where you cannot talk about that. It's very commonplace, and we saw a lot of this after a lot of this came forward after that NSA leak by Edward Snowden. So a common system of logging these requests is extremely important. We will discuss transparency as a tenet shortly, but you can start to see how the framework itself is worthless without other protections like transparency. But the second thing the framework needs to do is remove function creep. Like what we discussed earlier about the 2009 European Data Protection Supervisor, who suggested that current large-scale databases can be used in the future in different scenarios. The wording in the legislation needs to be very specific, which should not allow any interoperability of data that is being collected now in the future. In a way, we are saying that we should make the law future-proof so that it shouldn't be possible to use archived data to create new interpretations later.
Now, while we are on the topic of the specificity of the legal language, the mandates of national security and law enforcement is one thing that should be very clear. We need to ensure that accesses made for national security and general law enforcement are very explicitly distinguished from the get-go, because there are multiple gray areas that are being taken advantage of and that will continue to be taken advantage of. To reduce the ambit of national security mandate, we need to decrease the misuse of these ambiguous definitions. So, for example, one way to do this could be by limiting the purpose of the collection and the use of personal data. These purposes should be one, which are stated in law and thus can be known, at least in theory, to the individual at the time of the data collection, and two, for which the individual has given explicit consent, knowing full well what they are consenting to. Now, the Snowden leaks helped shed light on the blatant abuse of the Patriot Act in the US, which allowed FISA courts to operate under utmost secrecy with interpretations of the law unknown to the citizens. Countries used to maintain a wall that prevented law enforcement from obtaining data collected by intelligence or national security agencies during a time when we didn't have strong data protection. However, over the years, this wall has now been dismantled, with the result that intelligence agencies may now pass information to law enforcement officials and vice versa.
Yeah, and that brings us to the second tenet, transparency. There are a few things under transparency. The first one is in terms of availability. Every request made by the government under this system has to be available to the public after a cooling period. We call this a cooling period because we define this as the time frame after which the request is visible to the public. And this can be defined differently for accesses made for general law enforcement and matters of national security, which could have an extended period. The second thing is informed consent that Khushi just mentioned. Services By this, I mean private companies which collect data from their users should inform them exactly what data they will collect and how that data will be used. They also need to make the conditions under which this data would be made available to the government extremely clear before the sign up process completes. These details also cannot be hidden in obscure privacy policies and have to be an integral part of the onboarding process design before they get the user data. Now, Khushi, how many times have we run into this scenario? Say we're signing up for a service or setting up a new device, and we run into their privacy policy, either as a link to a document or a pop-up with pages and pages of legal lingo. We all end up skipping it and jumping straight to creating that account or setting up that new device. I just got a new laptop. I did exactly the same. But who knows what we agreed to, right?
Precisely. And this is a known issue. Now, the very people who make sure that we have privacy policy pages everywhere have agreed that most people do not take a single look at those documents. John Leibowitz, who served as the chairman of the FTC, the US Federal Trade Commission, said at a privacy roundtable back in December 2009, and I quote, "We all agree that consumers don't read privacy policies or EULAs for that matter. Now, that's a little troubling when the people who make privacy policy documents mandatory themselves agree that this doesn't work. We need regulations that will force data controllers to get user consent that is meaningful, that is informed, that is unambiguous."
Exactly. And that brings us to the rights of users in case of private data controllers and citizens if it's a surveillance issue. Now, the ownership of data is still with the user, and the user can demand access to it at any point of time. If a private data controller, or it can be public as well, but if it's a direct data controller which has taken this user's data. Now, on the other hand, as citizens, we should have access to the interpretation of our data, that is, how the government surveilled us and interpreted the pattern. And we should also have avenues to challenge that interpretation. Now, what I mean by this is, take an example. I go from place A to place B, and this data is shared to a government surveillance program by the application which was tracking me. Say I used a navigation application. And the government interprets that as something, maybe by the route I took or the pauses I made during the trip, or even the places I went to. And we have seen this happen. Governments do interpret certain things in a certain way. Now, I should have a recourse mechanism to challenge that interpretation and offer an alternative interpretation, because the government should first let me know that this is what they thought of that. More importantly, it is one thing to have a mechanism on paper and another to actually extend them to people everywhere. These avenues to challenge should not be available to only the privileged sections of the society. That would be the wealthy and powerful with access to specialized counsel who know the law. Equal access to ways of challenging these surveillance interpretations is paramount.
Exactly. Now, this brings us to some of the tenets that we discussed. Now, some of these have in fact been included in the implementation of some of the new privacy laws. GDPR, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation, does a good job of ensuring certain levels of transparency and accountability when it comes to data controllers. Now, this defines data controllers as public and private bodies that collect and process data at a large scale. There's also another category of companies, data processors, which do not themselves collect data but are provided with some sensitive data by controllers to process and return. However, the entire time the controller is responsible for what happens to the data. Now, all of this needs some sort of like an oversight mechanism. Now, this oversight is ensured by DPAs, also known as the Data Protection Authorities, which are independent of the government and have the power to handle complaints and roll out sanctions in terms of fines. On similar lines, the state of California passed a law called the CCPA, which stands for the California Consumer Protection Act, that affords similar protections as the GDPR, amongst others, to the residents of the state. Now, there are two more things that we like to conclude with. What is keeping governments from doing the right thing? What is keeping the governments from introducing regulations to build a just society with liberty protections? Now, the very idealistic nature of these questions gives the answer away. People with power will forever want to maintain the status quo and amass even more power. Any hint of a privacy preserving regulation will be met with either direct backlash or bureaucratic trickery from governments who want more surveillance. We need public awareness on how much data we are volunteering away to so many of these mass surveillance mechanisms. We need active citizenship to take over and help bring about effective regulations that will protect our rights.
And the laws we mentioned right now are anything but a small step in the right direction. Many countries like India, China, and Brazil started their own copycat versions of regulations which are very similar to the GDPR. This is a step forward in itself. A vastly uniform protection framework affords citizens of most countries with similar rights. However, we need to be vigilant as a society, as the whole world. From what we have seen, there are a lot of red flags about the way the adoption of these laws are playing out in the real world. For instance, China recently drafted the Personal Information Protection Law, PIPL, which goes into effect on the 1st of November this year, which is, again, similar to GDPR at a cursory glance, but unlike GDPR, PIPL, the Chinese law, does not restrict access by the Chinese government in any way to the personal information that the law sets out to protect in the first place. These are only for the private companies. The government can do essentially whatever they want with the same data from the private companies or their own.
Likewise, India's Data Protection Bill, which was passed in December 2019, is currently under a parliamentary joint committee, which has introduced changes that permits the central government power to declare any public department exempt from this law. Now, beyond the absolutely terrible privacy implications of these laws set out to build an Orwellian state, these laws go against the very fabric of democracy and essentially declare governments in power to be above the law. We need to voice our concerns. No, we need to force our governments to take action in the right direction. We need to ensure as much of the public knows about this as possible.
Which is where courses like this, New Geography, come in. Having conversations with your peers about just how much of an issue the unrestricted government access to their citizens' private data could be. These conversations are integral to calling for a plan of action. Now, pause and take a moment and think of everything you have ever bought and will ever buy on Amazon throughout your life. The people you have ever talked to on your phone and ever will. All of your past and future Tinder dates, and all of the text you have sent and will ever send on Instagram, as well as the Uber trips you have taken and will ever take.
Now, would you be okay with the knowledge that all of the information you just thought of and more are available to your government at their behest?